November 1947. Eastern Montana. The first hard frost had already blackened the last of the squash vines, and everyone who knew anything about winter in the Judith Basin knew what was coming. But nobody was watching the sky more closely than Sarah Harker. 3 weeks earlier, her husband's brother had taken the ranch. Legal papers, a judge's signature, a family dispute that ended with her standing in the yard with 2 canvas bags and $16 in coins. No cabin, no barn, no rights to the woodshed she'd stocked herself all summer. Just open ground, freezing nights, and a question that would either kill her or teach her something nobody else in that valley understood yet. Here's what nobody realized. Sometimes the worst moments force the kind of thinking that changes everything. And sometimes a woman with $16 and a month before snowfall sees things that men with workshops and lumber credit never will. If you want to see one practical frontier technique every week that actually worked when survival wasn't optional, hit subscribe right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what Sarah figured out in 1947 is about to make a lot of sense no matter where winter finds you. Sarah Harker wasn't a builder. She was a ranch cook who could patch a roof leak and keep a root cellar organized, but she'd never framed a wall or mixed mortar. Her father had been a railroad man. Her late mother had worked laundry. The only construction she'd ever watched closely was when the Civilian Conservation Corps boys put up their curved roof storage sheds back in '38. She remembered those sheds, remembered how they went up fast, remembered the shape, half a barrel lying on its side, ribs bent from flat steel, covered in whatever they could get cheap. And she remembered that half the CCC camps had been dismantled and sold for scrap after the war ended. The scrapyard in Lewistown wanted 25 cents per linear foot for the steel ribs. Sarah walked the fence line twice, counting, calculating. She bought 40 feet of curved rib steel, 6 salvaged fence posts, and a single roll of used tar paper that had been sitting in the weather so long the yard boss let it go for $2. $16. 11 cents left over. Her first thought wasn't about the firewood. It was about not freezing to death in her bedroll. She dragged the materials to a flat spot near a seasonal creek, low enough to block some wind, high enough that spring melt wouldn't flood it. She planted the fence posts in pairs, 8 feet apart, and bent the ribs across them, lashing everything with baling wire she'd picked out of the ditch grass. It looked like a bread loaf. It looked like a joke, but she kept going. The tar paper went over the ribs in overlapping rows, tacked down with tin scraps and more wire. She left one end open for a door and stuffed the gaps with cattail fluff and old burlap sacks. The work took 4 days. Her hands bled. The wire cut through her gloves. Neighbors driving past slowed down to stare, and one of them, a man named Eugene Cord who sold coal stoves and thought that made him an engineer, stopped long enough to yell from his truck. "You planning to live in that, Sarah? Or store potatoes?" She didn't answer. She was too busy realizing she had a problem she hadn't thought through. If she slept inside the shelter, there was no room for firewood. If she stacked firewood inside, there was no room for her. And if she left the wood outside like everyone else did, it would soak through by December and burn about as well as green fence posts. So she made the mistake that turned into the answer. She built a shelter bigger than she needed, 10 feet long instead of 6. Then she ran a low partition down the middle using scrap boards, chicken wire, and a wool army blanket she'd been issued during the drought relief drives. One side for a bedroll and a small sheet metal stove. The other side for firewood, stacked tight and off the ground on a pallet frame. It wasn't a plan. It was desperation and geometry. But the shape of that curved roof, the way it shed rain and snow straight down the sides instead of soaking through, and the fact that the whole structure sat just barely above the cold ground, surrounded by dense packed wood that acted like insulation, none of that was intentional. Sarah Harker thought she was building a survival shed. She had no idea she'd just solved the problem every homesteader in Montana dealt with and lost to every single winter. If you saw Sarah's shelter from the road, you saw a lump. A hump of black tar paper and rusty tin, stained with creek mud, held together with wire that glinted in the low sun like a desperate animal's ribs showing through. It didn't look like architecture. It looked like something a trapper would throw together and abandon by spring. But here's what was actually happening inside that curved shell and why it mattered more than anyone realized yet. The shape itself was the first advantage. A Quonset arch sheds precipitation at the steepest possible angle without requiring complicated framing. Rain hit the tar paper and rolled. Snow hit and slid. There was no flat roof to collect moisture, no eaves to funnel water into seams, no shingles to rot or warp. The whole structure was one continuous curve, and every drop of water that touched it ran down to the ground and away. That alone would have been useful. But it wasn't the part that changed everything. The firewood partition was. Sarah stacked her wood on the west side of the shelter, the side that caught the prevailing wind and the afternoon sun. She stacked it tight, bark side out, in rows that pressed against the chicken wire partition. The gaps between logs were small, maybe half an inch, just enough for air to move, but not enough for heat to pour through. What she didn't realize yet, she'd created a thermal buffer zone. The firewood wasn't just storage. It was insulation, a wall of dense, dry wood sitting between her living space and the outside air. When the wind hit the shelter, it hit firewood first. When the temperature dropped at night, the cold had to move through 2 feet of stacked pine and cottonwood before it ever reached the canvas and wool partition that separated her from the fuel. And because the whole shelter was low, just barely tall enough to crouch in, and because it was wrapped tight with tar paper over steel ribs, there was almost no air leakage. The only ventilation was a small gap at the top of the door and a 3-inch stovepipe that vented through a patched tin collar. Inside her half of the shelter, Sarah kept a small sheepherder stove, a flat-top box made of 1/8-inch steel that had been left behind by a herder who'd died of pneumonia the winter before. It burned hot and fast. A single armload of what could keep it glowing for 6 hours. But here's the part that made people laugh. She didn't stockpile firewood outside. Everything she gathered, split, and carried went straight into the shelter. She kept 4 weeks' worth of fuel inside at all times, rotating it from the back of the stack to the front, so the wood nearest the stove was always the driest. To anyone watching, it looked insane. Firewood belongs in a shed, in a lean-to, in a covered rack outside where it can season and dry. Storing it inside your shelter, especially a shelter that's small, that poorly built, that obviously temporary, seemed like the kind of mistake someone makes once before they burn their own roof down or fill the place with smoke and beetles. Eugene Cord said exactly that when he stopped by again in early December, hauling a load of coal to a ranch up the valley. You're going to get bugs, Sarah, and rot. And if a spark catches that tarp, you'll be toast before you can get the door flap open. He wasn't being cruel. He was being experienced. He'd sold stoves for 15 years. He'd seen people do dumb things with fire and wood in tight spaces. And everything about Sarah's setup looked dumb. What he didn't see, what nobody could see yet, was that the firewood wasn't getting wet. It wasn't rotting. It wasn't drawing moisture from the ground or the air, because the air inside the shelter was drier than the air outside. Why? Because Sarah burned wood every night. And every time she burned wood, the stove pulled moisture out of the air inside the shelter and vented it through the stovepipe. The heat didn't just warm her. It dried the space. And the driest part of that space was the firewood partition, where warm air from the stove rose, circulated, and settled into the gaps between the logs. She was accidentally running a low-temperature kiln. By mid-December, the wood she'd stacked in early November had seasoned faster than wood that had been sitting in open air for 6 months. Bark fell off in sheets. The log ends showed fine radial cracks. When she split a piece to check, the inner wood was pale and light, almost bone-dry. But nobody knew that yet. All they saw was a woman living in a tin can with a woodpile inside, and they assumed she'd either figure it out the hard way or freeze quietly and stop embarrassing herself. Eugene Cord told his wife that Sarah Harker wouldn't make it to New Year's. His wife said that was uncharitable. He said it wasn't charity she needed. It was common sense. By the time the first real snow came, Sarah had been living in the shelter for 23 days. She learned to crouch instead of stand, learned to keep the stove damper at half so the fire burned slow and even through the night, learned that if she banked the coals with ash at bedtime, she could restart the fire in the morning with 3 sticks and a twist of dry grass. She didn't talk much. She came into Lewistown once a week to pick up mail and trade eggs for salt. She paid for a bath at the rooming house every Sunday and didn't explain where she was living or how. People noticed anyway. Small towns notice everything. The women at the Methodist church said she looked tired but clean. The clerk at the mercantile said she smelled like wood smoke but didn't seem sick. The postmaster said she got a letter from her sister in Bozeman every 2 weeks and never mailed one back. But it was the men who had opinions. Eugene Cord had the loudest one. He held court at the Silver Spur Cafe most mornings, drinking coffee that was half chicory and explaining to anyone who'd listen why Sarah Harker's shelter was a disaster waiting to happen. You don't store firewood inside a living space, he said. It draws moisture. It draws bugs. It's a fire hazard and a health hazard and a plain, stupid hazard. A ranch foreman named Gil Peterson, who'd built 3 cabins and a bunkhouse, agreed. Wood needs to breathe, needs to season in open air. You stack it tight in a closed space, it'll mold up or catch beetles. And that tar paper she's using? 1 spark, 1 ember, and the whole thing goes up like a match head. Even the men who didn't have strong opinions had doubts. A younger homesteader named Jack Soames said he'd driven past Sarah's shelter twice, and both times it looked like something a kid would build in a ditch. An older cattle buyer named Vernon Haas said he didn't care how she lived, but if she froze to death out there, somebody'd have to dig the ground to bury her, and winter ground in Montana didn't dig easy. The general consensus was this: Sarah was stubborn, possibly foolish, definitely poor, and making choices that would either teach her a hard lesson or kill her outright. Either way, it wasn't anyone's job to stop her. She was a grown woman. She'd made her bed, or in this case, her curved tar paper tube, and she'd lie in it until reality or the cold convinced her otherwise. The women were quieter, but no kinder. Iris Drummond, who ran the boarding house, said Sarah had a proud streak that won't bend, and that pride like that usually broke before it learned. Mavis Cord, Eugene's wife, said she felt sorry for Sarah but didn't see what could be done. You can't help someone who won't ask for it, and you can't fix someone who thinks they know better than everyone else. A younger ranch wife named Patty Soames said she'd offered Sarah a spare room back in November and been turned down flat. I don't think she wants charity, Patty said. I think she wants to prove something, but I don't know what. Nobody did, because Sarah wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just trying to survive until spring without losing her dignity, her health, or the $16 worth of materials she'd scraped together when she had nothing else. But the town didn't see it that way. The town saw a woman doing something strange, and strangeness in a hard place usually means trouble. The coldest take came from a man named Raymond Fisk. Fisk had been a contractor in Great Falls before the war. He'd moved to the Judith Basin in '46 to run a sawmill and sell lumber to the post-war building boom. He knew wood, knew construction, knew building codes, even if nobody in Montana followed them very strictly. He came out to Sarah's shelter in mid-December, unannounced, driving a flatbed truck with a load of 2x4s heading to a ranch site. He stopped on the road, got out, and walked close enough to see the setup. Then he walked back to his truck, leaned against the door, and waited until Sarah came out. "You know that won't hold heat," he said. Not unkind, just matter of fact. Sarah looked at him, didn't answer. "Tar paper's got no R value," Fisk continued, "and you've got no foundation. Cold's coming up from the ground, and it's going out through that paper fast as your stove can make it. You'd be warmer in a snow cave." "I'm warm enough," Sarah said. Fisk shrugged. "Maybe now. Wait till January. Wait till it's 20 below for a week straight and the wind's coming down off the snowies with nothing to stop it. That stove will eat wood faster than you can feed it, and you'll still be cold." He looked at the wood pile inside the shelter, visible through the open door flap. "And storing your fuel in there?" He shook his head. "That's a mistake. Wood needs airflow to stay dry. You pack it in tight like that, it's going to sweat, going to mold. You'll be burning wet wood by February, and wet wood doesn't burn." Sarah didn't argue. She just nodded once, stepped back inside, and tied the door flap shut. Fisk stood there for a moment, then got back in his truck and drove off. He told the story at the sawmill that afternoon, told it like a cautionary tale. Some people, he said, won't learn till they suffer. His crew agreed. They'd all seen bad builds. They'd all seen people make choices that didn't pencil out. None of them thought Sarah Harker would make it to spring in that shelter. And none of them knew that by the time Fisk had finished his coffee that morning, the firewood inside Sarah's shelter was already drier than the wood in his own covered rack at home. The first serious cold hit on December 28, 1947. A high-pressure system settled over central Montana and sat there like a stone. The temperature dropped to 14 below zero that night. The next night, 18 below. By New Year's Day, it was 22 below at dawn, and the wind was coming steady out of the northwest at 15 miles an hour. It wasn't the coldest winter on record, but it was cold enough and it lasted. For the next 11 days, the temperature didn't climb above 10 degrees during the day. At night, it dropped into the teens and 20s below zero. The wind didn't stop. It came in steady, dry, and sharp, the kind of wind that burned exposed skin in 30 seconds and turned breath into ice crystals that hung in the air. This was the kind of cold that found every weakness in a structure. Cabins that had been fine in November started showing problems. Chinking cracked. Gaps opened around door frames. Floors that sat directly on the ground turned into sheets of ice on the underside. Stoves that had seemed efficient suddenly couldn't keep up, burning wood so fast that families were going through a week's supply in 3 days. And firewood, stored outside in sheds, under tarps, stacked in open racks, started to fail. Here's what happened and why it mattered. Montana winter air is cold, but it's also dry. When firewood sits outside in sub-zero temperatures, any moisture inside the wood freezes solid. Frozen wood doesn't burn well. It smolders. It hisses. It produces less heat per pound because the fire has to thaw and evaporate the ice before the wood can actually combust. Worse, when people brought frozen firewood inside to warm up before burning, condensation formed on the surface. That moisture soaked back into the wood. So even wood that had been dry in October was now damp by January, and getting damper every time it cycled between freezing outside and thawing inside. Eugene Cord, who prided himself on his well-stocked woodshed, started noticing the problem on January 2nd. His morning fire wouldn't catch cleanly. The kindling smoked. The splits hissed and spat. He had to use twice as much paper and leave the damper wide open just to get a sustainable flame. By January 5th, he was burning wood faster than he'd planned. His wife, Mavis, mentioned it at the church auxiliary meeting. "We're going through a quart a week," she said. "I don't know if we'll make it a March without buying more." Other families were having the same problem. Gil Peterson's ranch hands were complaining that the bunkhouse stove wouldn't hold heat overnight. They'd wake up to frost on the inside walls and coals so dead they had to restart from scratch. Jack Soames told his wife, Patty, that their woodpile was acting funny, his words. The splits looked dry, but they burned slow and left heavy ash. Patty said maybe they'd stacked it wrong. Jack said maybe, but he didn't know what wrong meant. Raymond Fisk, the sawmill contractor, had the best woodshed in the valley, a 3-sided pole barn with a shingled roof and open sides for airflow. His would have been split in July and stacked in August. It should have been perfect, but it wasn't. On January 7th, Fisk loaded his stove at bedtime like he always did. He woke up at 3 a.m. shivering. The fire had gone out. The wood had smoldered down to a few weak coals and quit. He restarted it, cursed, and went back to bed. The same thing happened the next night. And the night after that, he checked the wood. It looked fine, felt fine. But when he split a piece open, the center was darker than it should have been. Not wet exactly, but not dry either. Cold-soaked, dense, stubborn. Fisk didn't talk about it. He just burned more wood and figured the cold snap would break soon. It didn't. By January 10th, the entire Judith Basin was in survival mode. People stayed inside. Livestock stayed in barns. The road to Lewistown was passable, but barely, and only if you had chains and way in the bed. At the Silver Spur Cafe, the morning regulars talked about the cold the way sailors talk about storms, with respect, dark humor, and a little bit of fear. "Coldest since 36, someone said. "Colder than 36, someone else corrected. "This is 19 cold. This is Armistice Day cold." Eugene Cord sat at the counter, nursing his coffee, not saying much. His woodshed was half empty. His stove was eating wood like a beast, and he was starting to do the math on whether he'd need to buy a cord from Fisk before February. Nobody had seen Sarah Harker in town since Christmas. Vernon Haas mentioned it. Somebody should check on her. Mavis Cord said, I'm sure she's fine. But she didn't sound sure. She sounded like she was hoping someone else would check, so she wouldn't have to. Then, on January 12th, the wind stopped. The temperature stayed low, 18 below at dawn, but the air went still. The sky cleared to a blue so hard and bright it hurt to look at. Smoke from every chimney in the valley rose straight up, white and sharp against the cold. And that's when people started noticing something strange. Sarah Harker's stovepipe was barely smoking. Eugene Cord saw it first. He was driving past her shelter on his way to the Soames ranch, and he slowed down because he thought maybe she'd frozen and the fire had gone out. But then he saw movement. The door flap opened. Sarah stepped out, pulled a handful of split wood from just inside the entrance, and stepped back in. The flap closed. No struggle. No desperation. Just routine. Cord sat there in his truck for a full minute, idling, staring at that curved black hump of tar paper and tin. Then he drove on. He didn't say anything to anyone that day. But the next morning at the cafe, he mentioned it. Sarah's still out there, he said. Of course she is, Gil Peterson said. Where else would she be? No, I mean she's fine. I drove past yesterday. She's barely burning any wood. Peterson frowned. How do you know? Stovepipe's barely smoking. I've seen her fire. It's small. Real small. Raymond Fisk looked up from his eggs. That doesn't make sense. In this cold? A small fire won't keep anything warm. Cord shrugged. I'm just telling you what I saw. Nobody knew what to make of it. But over the next few days, other people started noticing the same thing. Sarah's stovepipe put out a thin, steady thread of smoke. Not the thick white plume of a fire being pushed hard. Not the black chuff of wet wood struggling to burn. Just a fine, almost invisible trail of heat. And when she came into town on January 15th to trade eggs and pick up mail, she looked fine. Tired, maybe. Thinner, definitely. But not frostbitten. Not sick. Not desperate. Iris Drummond at the boarding house asked her outright, How are you managing out there, Sarah? Sarah smiled, a small, tight smile. I'm managing. But the cold, I stay warm enough. That was all she'd say. But the question was starting to spread. How is she staying warm? How is she burning so little wood? And why, when everyone else in the valley was struggling with damp firewood and guttering fires, did Sarah Harker, living in a homemade tar paper shelter that shouldn't even be standing, seem to be doing just fine? Stay with me, because the number that answered that question didn't just surprise the valley. It humiliated every so-called expert who'd written her off. On January 18th, 1948, Raymond Fisk did something he later said he regretted, though not for the reason people expected. He drove out to Sarah Harker's shelter with a thermometer. Not to help, not to apologize, to settle an argument with Eugene Cord, who'd insisted the day before that Sarah's fire had to be putting out more heat than it looked, because otherwise she'd be frozen solid. Fisk said that was impossible. A small fire in a tar paper shelter with no insulation couldn't hold heat in 20 below weather. It defied basic thermodynamics. Cord said, then go measure it. So Fisk did. He pulled up just after dawn, 6:47 a.m. by his pocket watch. The outside temperature, measured on the shaded side of his truck, was 19 degrees below zero. There was no wind. The sky was clear. The sun hadn't crested the ridge yet. He walked up to the shelter, knocked on the frame near the door flap. Sarah, it's Raymond Fisk. I need a word. The flap opened. Sarah looked out, her breath puffing white in the frozen air. She was wearing a wool coat over a flannel shirt, and her hands were bare. Mr. Fisk, I want to check something, he said, holding up the thermometer. Just takes a minute. I'm not here to bother you. She looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come in if you're coming. You're letting the heat out. Fisk crouched and stepped through the low door. What he saw inside stopped him cold. The space was small, so small he had to crouch and couldn't stand upright. The ceiling was the curve of the tar paper over the ribs, maybe 4.5 feet at the tallest point. The floor was hard dirt covered with a single layer of old canvas. On the left side, Sarah's side, there was a bedroll, a wooden crate serving as a table, a tin cup, a kerosene lamp, and the small sheepherder's stove. The stove was glowing faintly, barely, Fisk could see the dull red glow through the seams in the firebox, but there were no flames visible through the top vent. On the right side, behind the chicken wire and wool blanket partition, was the firewood. Stacked tight, dry, no snow, no frost, no condensation on the logs. The air inside was warm. Not hot, not stovetop hot, but warm enough that Fisk could feel the difference immediately. His skin stopped stinging. His breath stopped clouding as thick. He hung the thermometer on a nail near the center of the space and waited. Sarah stood by the door, watching him. She didn't say anything. After 2 minutes, Fisk checked the thermometer. 53 degrees Fahrenheit. He stared at it, checked it again, pulled his own pocket thermometer out, and hung it next to the first one. 2 minutes later, 52 degrees. He turned to Sarah. Ow! She looked at him like the question didn't make sense. How what? It's 19 below outside. You got tar paper for walls. No foundation. A stove the size of a bread box with barely any fire in it. He gestured at the thermometer. This shouldn't be possible. Sarah shrugged. I keep the fire low. I keep the door shut. I don't waste wood. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Fisk looked around the space again. Looked at the partition. Looked at the firewood stacked tight against it. Looked at the way the ceiling curved down close, trapping every bit of rising heat. Then he pulled a split log off the stack and examined it. The bark was loose. The wood was light. When he knocked 2 pieces together, they rang with a dry, bright sound. He looked at Sarah. How long has this been stacked in here? Since November. It's drier than kiln wood. I know. You're not just storing it. You're drying it. Sarah didn't confirm or deny. She just waited. Fisk set the log back on the stack, carefully, like he was putting down something he shouldn't have touched. You're burning a quarter the wood I am, he said quietly. Aren't you? I don't know what you burn, Mr. Fisk, but you're barely feeding that stove. I feed it what it needs. Fisk crouched there in the warm, dry air of that ridiculous tar paper shelter, and for the first time in 15 years of professional building, he didn't have an explanation. He left without saying anything else. But the numbers stayed with him. 53 degrees inside, 19 below outside, a 72-degree difference, sustained on a fire so small it was barely smoking. He went back to the cafe, told Cord, told Peterson, told the men at the sawmill. She's got bone-dry firewood, he said, drier than anything I've got, drier than anything you've got, and she's burning maybe 3 for splits a day to stay above 50 degrees. Cord didn't believe it. That's not possible. I measured it. Then she's got something else going. A second heat source. There's nothing else, Eugene. Just that stove. And the firewood. Well, firewood doesn't dry itself. It does if you store it inside and keep a low fire running. Silence. Then Peterson said, You're telling me that woman, who we all said was doing it wrong, figure out something we didn't? Fisk nodded. That's exactly what I'm telling you. By the end of January, other people had checked. Jack Soames stopped by with his wife, Patty. They brought a loaf of bread as an excuse, but really they wanted to see inside. Sarah let them in. Patty noticed the warmth immediately. Jack noticed the firewood. He picked up a split, felt the weight, and set it down carefully. This is seasoned better than mine, he said. Sarah nodded. It stays dry in here. How much do you burn a day? For maybe 5 pieces, 6 if it's real cold. Jack did the math in his head. His own stove was eating 12 to 15 splits a day just to keep the cabin livable. He looked at his wife. She looked back. They thanked Sarah and left. 3 weeks later, Jack built a wood partition inside his cabin, stored 2 weeks of firewood indoors. By the end of February, he was burning 30% less than before. The same thing happened across the valley. Vernon Haas started storing firewood in his mudroom. Eugene Cord built a rack inside his back porch. Gil Peterson put up a partition in the ranch bunkhouse and told the hands to stack their fuel inside. Nobody made a big announcement. Nobody said Sarah was right and we were wrong. But by the time the snow started melting in late March, 17 households in the Judith Basin had modified their setups to store and dry firewood indoors. And every single one of them used less wood that winter than the winter before. Sarah Harker didn't say anything about it. She kept living in the shelter through April, then moved into a rented room in town when the ground thawed. She worked at the boarding house through the summer, saved money, and bought a small homestead plot in the fall. She never built another Quonset shelter. She didn't need to. What she'd figured out by accident, what the valley learned by necessity, was this: dry firewood burns hotter, longer, and cleaner than cold-soaked wood. And the fastest way to dry firewood in winter isn't to leave it outside in the weather. It's to bring it inside, stack it near your heat source, and let the same fire that keeps you warm prepare the fuel that keeps that fire alive. It's a closed loop. Efficient. Elegant. Obvious in hindsight. And it came from a woman with $16, no formal training, and a month to live or die by what she could figure out on her own. By the spring of 1948, Sarah Harker's name had become shorthand for something nobody in the Judith Basin quite knew how to articulate. She wasn't famous. She wasn't celebrated. There was no article in the Lewistown News Argus about her shelter or her methods. No county extension agent came out to document what she'd done. No engineering professor from Bozeman drove up to take measurements or photographs. But her name came up in conversations. When Jack Soames showed a neighbor his indoor wood partition, he said, "It's sort of like what Sarah Harker did." When Eugene Cord finally admitted to his wife that storing firewood inside had cut their consumption by nearly 40%, Mavis said, "You mean the way Sarah was doing it all along?" When Raymond Fisk designed a heated lumber-drying shed for his sawmill the following autumn, a low-roof structure with a small stove and racks that used waste heat to season green wood faster, he didn't credit Sarah directly. But he told his foreman, "I got the idea watching how dry wood stays when you keep it near steady warmth." The foreman knew what he meant. Sarah herself never claimed credit for anything. She moved into Iris Drummond's boarding house in late April, paid rent by working the kitchen and cleaning rooms, and saved every dollar she didn't spend. By October, she had enough to lease a small homestead plot 8 miles south of town, a quarter section with a spring, a stand of cottonwoods, and a one-room cabin that needed a new roof but had good bones. She moved in before the first snow. This time, she had a proper woodshed, a proper stove, a proper chimney, but she still kept 2 weeks' worth of firewood stacked inside, near the stove, rotating it from the back of the pile to the front as she burned it. Old habits. Good habits. She lived on that homestead for the next 31 years. Raised chickens. Kept a garden. Sold eggs in town, and occasionally helped neighbors with late-season canning when their hands were too arthritic to manage the jars. She never married again. Never spoke much about the winter of 1947. When people asked, new folks, mostly who'd heard the stories secondhand, she'd shrug and say, "I did what I had to." That was the truth. But it wasn't the whole truth. What Sarah Harker figured out that winter wasn't just about firewood. It was about efficiency under constraint. About the difference between what people assume works and what actually works when you strip away everything but necessity. The men who criticized her, Cord, Fisk, Peterson, weren't stupid. They were experienced. They knew construction, materials, and systems. They'd built cabins, sheds, and barns that had lasted decades. They understood thermal mass, draft, and ventilation in ways Sarah never formally learned. But they'd never had to build a shelter for $16. They'd never had to choose between staying warm and staying fed. They'd never been forced to test every assumption against the hard edge of survival. Sarah had, and in that testing, she'd stumbled onto something that frontier people had known for generations, but that modern building practices had started to forget. Proximity matters more than volume. It's not about having a giant woodpile outside. It's about having dry wood within arm's reach when you need it. It's not about burning hotter. It's about burning smarter, using smaller fires that produce steady, sustainable heat instead of roaring blazes that eat through fuel and fade by midnight. It's not about fighting the cold with brute force. It's about creating small, efficient spaces that trap warmth, shed moisture, and turn every scrap of heat into work. The Quonset shape itself, accident though it was, embodied these principles perfectly. The curve shed precipitation without complex carpentry. The low profile reduced the volume of air that needed heating. The tight envelope minimized heat loss. And the thermal buffer of stacked firewood acted as both insulation and a passive dehumidifier, creating conditions that improved the fuel even as the fuel improved the living conditions. It was a system, unintentional, improvised, and born from desperation, but a system nonetheless. And systems like that, systems that work without needing explanation, that succeed because they align with physical reality rather than assumptions, those are the systems that survive, that get copied, that spread quietly through communities until they're no longer innovations. They're just how things are done. By 1955, the Judith Basin had changed in small ways that nobody talked about, but everyone noticed. Fewer families ran out of firewood before spring. Fewer cabins filled with smoke from wet wood that wouldn't catch. Fewer children woke up to frost on the inside walls because the fire had died overnight. Wood consumption dropped. Not dramatically, maybe 15–20% on average, but consistently. Enough that people noticed. Enough that it mattered. And if you'd asked why, most folks would have said, we just started keeping some wood inside. Keeps it drier. They wouldn't have said, Sarah Harker taught us that. But she had. Not through lectures. Not through demonstrations. Just by surviving a winter that should have killed her and walking out the other side with a method that made more sense than the old way. Sarah Harker died in 1979 at the age of 73. She had a heart attack in her garden between the tomato plants and the squash vines on a warm afternoon in late August. The neighbor who found her said she looked peaceful, like she just sat down to rest. Her obituary in the Lewistown paper was 4 sentences long. It mentioned that she'd lived in the area since 1947, that she'd worked at the boarding house, and that she was survived by a sister in Bozeman and several nieces and nephews. It didn't mention the shelter, didn't mention the winter, didn't mention the firewood or the thermometer or the fact that a contractor named Raymond Fisk had once crouched in her makeshift home and realized he didn't understand heat as well as he thought he did. But the people who'd been there, who'd lived through that winter, who'd watched Sarah survive it, who'd quietly adopted her methods and never quite admitted why, those people remembered. And some of them passed it on. In 1983, a young homesteader named Michael Vasquez moved to the Judith Basin from New Mexico. He bought a cheap plot near the old Harker homestead, didn't know the name, didn't know the history, and started building a cabin with salvage materials and a tight budget. An older rancher named Jack Soames stopped by one afternoon to see how the work was going. Saw that Vasquez was planning to build an outdoor woodshed. You might want to keep some of that inside, Soames said. Inside? Yeah, 2 weeks worth maybe. Stack it near the stove. Keeps it dry. Burns better. Vasquez thought about it. That's a lot of space. It's a lot of heat, Soames said. Trust me. Vasquez did. Built a partition. Stacked his wood inside. That winter, his first Montana winter, he burned 40% less than he'd budgeted for. He told his cousin about it the next summer. His cousin told a friend. The friend built a cabin in Wyoming and did the same thing. The knowledge spread. Quietly. Slowly. Person to person. Not as a revolutionary idea. Just as common sense that worked. And if you trace it back, if you follow the thread through the decades, through the conversations and the copy designs and the small modifications that people made without knowing why, you end up in a tar paper shelter on the edge of the Judith Basin in the winter of 1947. You end up with a woman who had $16 a month to live and a problem everybody said couldn't be solved the way she was trying to solve it. But she solved it anyway. Not because she was brilliant, not because she was defiant, but because she didn't have the luxury of being wrong. And sometimes, maybe more often than we admit, that kind of necessity teaches things that comfort never could. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What part of Sarah's solution could you use today? Not in a survival situation, not in a crisis, just in the ordinary work of keeping warm, staying dry, and making your resources last a little longer than you thought they could. Because the principles haven't changed. Dry wood burns better than wet wood. Small, efficient fires outlast big, wasteful ones. In proximity. Keeping what you need close to where you'll use it saves more energy than almost anything else you can do. Sarah Harker knew that. She proved it. And the proof didn't just survive one winter. It survived generations. Drop a comment below and tell me. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? I read every comment. And if you want more stories like this, Real techniques, real people, real results from a time when getting it wrong meant freezing. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because this isn't just history, it's knowledge. And knowledge like this doesn't disappear unless we let it. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.